Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Resuming Debate. It's great to be with you today. A lot of my parliamentary work relates to international development and foreign policy. And I've been thinking a lot about Africa, especially in the last year. A couple of reasons why I think Africa is extremely important as we consider Canada's foreign policy and the future of the world that will be in the decades ahead. First of all, Africa has a very young population. If you look at median age, Canada's median age, as well as that of most Western countries, is in their 40s. Most African countries have median ages in the teens, which means much younger populations. And that means that Africa's population will continue to grow and shape the world in various ways. The other important thing to think about in terms of Africa is in the midst of Africa's population and economic growth, it is kind of a field where both of the poles in the global competition we're seeing are trying to have an influence. So we're seeing escalating global competition between Western powers on the one hand and authoritarian revisionist powers like Russia and China. And a lot of where that competition is being waged, where both sides are trying to gather more influence, is in Africa. So if you think about how in elections we tend to pay attention to the swing states, the states or the voters that are in the middle, you could say that African countries are in many cases swing states in this world of increasing global competition. So I wanted to have this episode where we just discuss Canada-Africa relations, some of the economic opportunities, but the other issues as well, and here's some good perspectives on why Africa is important and what Canada needs to do to engage more with Africa. So I'm joined today by two excellent guests, Mr. Sebastian Spio-Garbrah. He is the former chair of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business. He's a Canadian who works on Canada-Africa business relations especially. Sebastian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And also pleased to be joined by Lawrence Songa. Lawrence is not a Canadian, although he knows Canada and has spent time here. He is a member of Parliament in Uganda, representing the Ora County area. Lawrence, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Let's dive right in, and maybe Sebastian, you can answer this first one here. On the economic side, I think when a lot of people think of Africa, they go to the stereotype of poverty. And there is still poverty in Africa, that's a reality. But there's also a great deal of opportunity for trade and investment that is mutually beneficial. So how do you push back on some of the stereotypes that exist, and how should we see this reality of both, yes, continuing need for development assistance, but also opportunities for trade and investment?
I think in a certain sense, if anything, the last 3 years have maybe brought into stark relief the fact that those two dichotomies can exist at the same time. So you could have, for instance, a country as wealthy and as technologically advanced as China, all of a sudden deal with an outbreak of illness that supposedly came from, probably around meat markets or animal markets, so to speak. You saw how in the ensuing days, great and mighty nations like Italy, like the United States, grappled with COVID. So many people were dying, if you recall. And obviously in Canada, we didn't have as heavy an outbreak as we did in some other countries. But we also saw what happened in India, that India also had a tough time initially grappling with COVID. And ironically, beyond anybody's imagination, it's still something that is a miracle, to put it in almost religious terms. Africa somehow dealt with COVID much, much, much better than most other countries in the world. And I haven't seen enough papers written on this. And I think there's something there that the stereotypes that we have, even those of us in the international development space have, that largely Africa needs help. Africa needs help, whether the help is trade or the help is aid or the help is some other type of help. We realize that Africa obviously needs partnerships, and it needs collaborations, but that the economic situation, the reality of the economic situation in Africa is very variegated, and that in some respects, in certain areas, for instance, as an example, in the area of money, financial technology, and mobile money transfers, etc., Africa is way ahead of Canada. I mean, Canada has one of the highest, as you know, as a member of parliament, Canada has one of the highest costs for telephony and for internet and for telephone services. And it's very clunky, as opposed to in Kenya or Uganda or Nigeria, where you can pay, your grocery bill or you can pay your gas bill from your cell phone. It's something that I don't think Canadians can even contemplate yet. So yes, in many respects, I think that there are structural challenges, clearly, of education, of healthcare, of roads, infrastructure, clearly, absolutely. But Africa story is a much more complex one. And in some respects, I would say that we in Canada or in the West, broadly speaking, want a one-size-fits-all sort of approach because it's just easier. We don't have the manpower at global affairs or in CEDA or EDC to really deal with all the different variegations of development in Uganda or in Madagascar or in Ghana. So we tend to have broad brush policies, which obscures and misses major points. So I think the long and short of the answer is that yes, Africa continues to have, I'm not one of those who believes that we should be Pollyannish about the developmental challenges in Africa. I mean, you just have to drive an hour out of Lagos or an hour out of Accra or an hour out of Kampala, and you would see in stark relief the situation. So even in Johannesburg, an hour out of Johannesburg. But I do think that the difficulty for Western policy is how to engage Africa in a way that is meaningful. And I think this is where, to pivot to your introduction, this is where the Chinese and to a lesser degree the Russians have done a much better job, because I think they have a much more sophisticated view, especially the Chinese, of the different opportunities and risks within Africa. And I think that their policies are targeted more at those silos, so to speak. Whereas I think that for ideological and historical reasons, it's much harder for the Western countries to pivot away from the shibboleths, the paradigms that we've set for ourselves on Africa.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Lawrence, do you want to maybe weigh in on the same point? How do you think some of these stereotypes or perceptions of kind of poverty dominating the landscape in Africa are limiting engagement, and what are the things that that people in the West, Canada, and other Western countries need to know and understand about the economic and other opportunities associated with engagement?
I want to thank you for the invitation, and I'm also grateful that I'm able to participate. Uganda and Canada established a diplomatic relation in 1962. There had been a lot of cooperation with Canada, between Canada and Uganda. Canada export to Uganda amounts to about $34 million, but import from Uganda is about 17. So there is still a gap. And if you look at the GDP, for us, we are talking about only 54. Canada is talking about beyond 2,000. Mm-hmm. These are real scenarios. But what is important is we have some opportunities we can explore between Canada and Uganda. Much as Uganda's economy not developed, but we have resources that can be exploited to the advantage of both countries. And I'm happy we are able now to export even agricultural produce to Canada, and Uganda being agriculture economy and where majority of the people are farmers, unfortunately, most of them are smallholder farmers, we can have cooperation in strengthening agriculture. And if we can strengthen agriculture, that is the backbone of the Uganda's economy. And if we can have exports of those agricultural produce, we shall be able to sell at higher at higher price. But number two, if we can also establish processing facilities so that we can do some value addition of those perishable agricultural sector. And that will require good transport system, but also good energy access, which should be really strong, but also affordable for the population. So in the areas of agriculture, I think that's one area where we can really cooperate. But Canada had been assisting Uganda for a very long time in the area of education, research, but we just need to scale up that kind of cooperation so that we can develop both economies. Another wealth we have is in the areas of minerals. Now that powers around the world are trying to see how they can exploit minerals, especially the critical ones, which unfortunately are found mostly in Africa. In the areas of minerals, especially the critical minerals, we have potential of actually generating about $12 billion. And that is an area where we need a lot of capacity building, areas where we need access to energy, areas where we need access to transport and skilled labor force. So that is one area of cooperation that we can strengthen between Canada and Uganda. And we are also grateful that Canada, in most of the issues that had been taking place in Africa, Canada had been apparently neutral in most of the issues. And so for us, we don't have any reservation working with Canada because we have not got any signal that Canada got involved in some issues, maybe the conflict in the region. So that is a very good strong point, which we can also build on so that we can work in this kind of cooperation.
Those are great points. I was just in Kenya last week, and it sounds like, in terms of agriculture, certainly the situation is very similar between Uganda and Kenya, where large numbers of smallholder farmers who are looking to increase their yields, access value added, and export opportunities. You know, I certainly got the sense that there are times of year where there's great abundance, and that means very low food prices for farmers. So being able to do value-added export, and selfishly, we need to get as many mangoes from East Africa to Canada for for our enjoyment. Because from what I understand, during the mango harvesting season, the prices are so incredibly low compared to what we pay in Canada, and the mangoes. Mangoes in East Africa are phenomenal. So that's a bit of a digression, but anyways, Sebastian, if you can maybe pick up on the point just about specific sectors that Lawrence was talking about, agriculture, energy. Canada's economy has had as a major part of it resource production and export. Does this make partnerships around agricultural energy exploitation potentially particularly fruitful? Where do you see the most promise there?
I think, in the past, you've obviously had most of the commercial engagement between Canada and Africa has been around the extractive sector. So mining companies, energy companies. So in a certain sense, Canada's engagement with Africa has often come through, engagement with companies that are based out west, in the prairies, and also on the Quebec side. And then you obviously have the TSX, which is the largest market globally for companies and individuals and entities looking to raise money for mining and extractives. So I would say probably 70-80% of all the engagement between Canada and Africa on a commercial basis have generally been around these. Obviously, there's also historically some engagement around Bombardier and as a big and major player in the infrastructure space. Ironically, Canadian banks, if I was in your shoes, one of the questions I would ask or raised in the parliament would be Canadian banks. Canadian banks are wholly missing from Africa. I mean, it is something that is very bizarre and mysterious. Why you can't find a single major transaction in any African country, from South Africa all the way to Morocco. I mean, where you have RBC, TD Bank, BMO engaged in Africa. So it's a very strange area of a lacuna, a kind of a gap in the market that I think could be quite interesting, because honestly, for the small and medium-sized businesses in Canada, which dominate the Canadian business landscape, to be able to engage properly with Africa, you need financial intermediation and financial support. So, assuming that in our brother Lawrence Songa's district, there's a farmer there who is looking to export a particular product to a grocery chain in Saskatchewan or in Alberta or someplace, who would finance that transaction? How will it be actually implemented? And this is where I think, again, going back to the success that the Europeans, generally speaking, and the Asians, especially the Chinese, are increasingly having in Africa. And this is a mistake, by the way. I used to, for many years, advise a lot of Japanese companies in their business dealings in Africa. And this is also a mistake the Japanese made. The Japanese never really, they had, JOGMEC and JOGMAC and all these other state-owned entities that dealt with the countries, but they never had Sumitomo's, Toshiba, the large Japanese banks open branches anywhere in Africa. And if you look at the last 100 years or so of European engagements in Africa, whether you look at Societe Generale or you look at Barclays Bank or Standard Chartered Bank or Standard Bank, I mean, these were the banks that underpinned the relationship between Africa and Europe. So I would say that if I was, I mean, to give any unsolicited advice to our friend, Right Honourable Pierre Poilievre, or yourselves, or I mean, even the Prime Minister, Right Honourable Prime Minister, I would say I would target the Canadian banking system and say, you know what, how much of your risk capital, how much of your engagement, even if it's 2%, even if it's 3%, even if it's 4%, how much of it is dedicated to Africa? And I don't think any risk analysis that is honest, done in the boardroom of any of those banks, can justify why there's almost zero engagement by any of these banks in Africa. It just doesn't make any sense. To me, I think that predates all the actual projects, solar projects, renewables, agriculture, all these wonderful projects. Without financing, can't really take off.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting, and I want to come back to your point about how kind of large institutions do risk analysis and whether they do it in a way that's objective or reflects certain biases. But before that, Lawrence, I'll go to you if you want to comment at all on the banking relationship issue. I also wanted to probe further your comment about Canada being perceived as neutral, because it seems to me that many other Western countries, certainly European countries, have a colonial history in Africa, and that carries with it, baggage, memories of injustice, and Canada does not have that same history. So does that position us differently in our engagement because we don't have that past colonial presence?
To start on the issue of financial institution or banking, agree with the points Sebastian raised, because it is really important. If we are to do business, we must have financial services that can aid that business. And I think I really want to agree there. And on the neutrality, definitely, like you explained, Canada does not have any history or colonial history with Africa. But this is the opportunity that Canada should really use to cooperate, but also to empower a country like Uganda or some of developing countries. For example, if you take my region grows a lot of Arabica. At one time, we were exporting those small quantity to Canada, but we still have no market for that good coffee. So if we can promote coffee, it can empower the farmers. But number two, the export to Uganda of Canada being about $33 or $34 million. And this would call for encouraging some of those industries to come and establish themselves on the African soil, where the labor force is actually deeper areas where we can actually cooperate. In terms of education, most of, let's say, Ugandan students or African students have been coming to Canada. Although one area where they how to access Canadian, but that can be strengthened also.
Sebastian, you talked about the risk analysis that large institutions do, and there's an issue of risk analysis that investors undertake, but there's also an issue of comfort and familiarity. And if you haven't been present in an area for a long time, then you're going to perceive that area as being more risky because you just don't know. Whereas it may be that there are areas which are of higher risk, where investors, pension funds, banks are just more comfortable operating because they've been there for a while. I think, for instance, you compare a risk analysis around investing in Africa versus investments in China. There's a tendency to see a lot of potential in China and to invest less in Africa, and yet there are big risks associated with China, and there are big potential opportunities in Africa. So, what is your message to institutional investors, to banks, just about how they do these risk analyses and whether they're being done objectively or not?
Thank you. My own daily profession is I'm a political risk analyst, and I've been doing this for almost 20 years. That's sort of my actual profession. So I deal with this with this matter almost on a daily, regular basis. I think part of it is a dearth of information. So if, for instance, you ask yourself, the average banker in Toronto or the average corporate executive in Montreal, how much do they know about what's going on in Africa? And the part of the problem is on our side as Africans, because we have 54, 55 countries, depending on how you count them. And I deal with the ambassadors in Ottawa all the time. I'm friends with many of them. I've worked with many of them on so many things. And yet the problem is that if we have 18 voices or 36 voices or 42 voices on Africa, Togo is writing a letter to BMO, and Burundi is writing a letter to BMO, and Uganda is writing a letter to BMO. It's not going to yield much results. But you can imagine a scenario where the African countries represented in Ottawa, and I'm talking here specifically about engagement in Canada, came together and said, look, let's finance a campaign to educate Canadian businesses and Canadian institutions about what's going on in Africa, to sort of invite the chairman of, some of these banks or some of these big organizations to an event where we ask what is their thinking about Africa, what are their concerns, etc., etc. So I think that part of the challenge, part of the ease with China or India is that you are dealing with one government, or Brazil, you are dealing with one major government. They may have more staff in Ottawa, maybe, I don't know, but it's entirely possible that China may have 15 people in Ottawa and maybe 20 in Toronto, who every day are dealing with commercial activity and commercial issues that deal with China, right? But in the embassy of Togo, you might have one, embassy of Ivory Coast, you might have one, embassy of Ghana, you might have two, the embassy of Nigeria, you might have two, the embassy of South Africa, you may have three. And in aggregate, we may all have more commercial officers in aggregate. But because everyone is selling their own story, and their story in a grand scheme of things are quite small compared to the markets that, say, China or India would have, I think that it makes the dissemination of information very difficult. So part of the risk bias, I don't think it's because the risk analyst or the banks or the pension funds have an inherent negative bias towards Africa. But if I'm at Case Depot or I'm at Ontario Teachers Pension Fund and I wake up in the morning and I have 1,000 different things, interest rates are moving left, right, and center, currencies are moving left, right, and center. Maybe I have a headache, maybe my kid was screaming in my ears at overnight, etc., etc. If I get to my desk and there are two delegations and there's one from Brazil or one from India telling me all the different bonds in India, Ontario Teachers Pension can invest in, and the sovereign risk guarantee of the Indian government, etc., etc. And then I have, Togo and Uganda and Ghana also looking to raise something for an infrastructure project. It's more likely than not, with my limited time, I probably would go to those ones where I think I can get more out of it. So even at a functional level, in terms of pooling resources, for instance, why can't we have the SADC region there, the Southern African Development Corporation area, or the West Africa ECOWAS region, issuing a bond that helps to build a road from Lagos all the way to Dakar? Why can't we have maybe a bond issued by the East African Community that is as an internationally subscribed bond that helps to finance the railway line from Mombasa into Kampala? So to me, I think that the newer generation of African professionals, and those of us who have had the privilege of working in a number of these places, we have to begin to radically leverage sort of the regional networks to solve the problems. And I am a big believer that, yes, we can have particularized foreign policies or particularized national policies on different things. But I think that in our engagement with foreign entities, so when Africa is dealing with Europe or Africa is dealing with Canada, my sense is that the different countries working in silos tends to exacerbate this risk problem. Because, to give you a final example, and I'll stop talking here, let's say I'm the government of Congo, or I'm the government of, say, Uganda. Let's say Uganda, since our brother Ugandan is on the line. And I'm trying to raise financing for a project in Uganda. But I go into the room and the analyst or the financier says, but there's some little war going on in Eastern Congo. And I see that Eastern Congo is on the border of Uganda, and I know that this particular project may be in the Lake Victoria region, which may affect Uganda. What do you say? You may not have much to say that would convince him. But you can imagine if, for instance, you're doing a project in Uganda which abuts, these countries, and we had a more regional approach in terms of infrastructural development, infrastructural financing. So in that same room, when that question is asked by the pension fund, the Ugandan would defer to his Congolese colleague and say, okay, maybe you answer this question. That has been my experience of almost 20 years of dealing with these political risk perception issues, that a lot of the time the investor doesn't have the time or the resources or the information necessary.
Thank you. I think that's very revealing. I think we're starting to see, as you say, some of this happening. I mean, obviously there's the African Free Trade Deal, there's the African Union. Lawrence, I wonder if you want to comment on this question as well of this issue that Sebastian's raised about regional collaboration, regional institutions engaging together to attract investment. Do you see this as being a helpful trend, and is it something that we're going to see more of?
I agree with the point Sebastian raised. The regional initiatives are very good for also regional cooperation, because if you take in terms of conflict in the region, like in the DRC, in Central African Republic, in Chad, if we use the regional approach, it will bring together all stakeholders in the different countries and to cooperate on a particular project. And that will be a uniting factor. I think I want to agree with that point. The reason why China is having a big presence in Africa is because they are focusing on the things that are burning to the local population, like the road infrastructure, the health facilities in the rural areas. Because this cooperation, let's say from the Western world, in most cases, it is not direct, it is through another international organization. That is also a challenge because a country like Uganda is not getting it directly. It must come through another entity. But if we can have direct cooperation with these countries and on regional projects like infrastructure connecting, maybe working on the road from Uganda up to Juba in South Sudan, that will make it very strong. And therefore, China is having presence in Africa because they are focusing on infrastructure. And they are giving high interest loans. But Africa has no alternative where to run for soft loans. So if countries like Canada can come in and give alternatives to those issues that are driving China, for example, in Africa, definitely African government will cooperate with China on some of those issues. But why they run to China is because they don't have alternative. And yet in the long run, that loan is going to be extremely expensive African countries. So I agree, regional projects, cross-border projects are very good, but areas of infrastructure are very key. Areas of water, water and healthcare, very key to the population.
Thank you, Lawrence. I want to drill further specifically now onto this issue of China's engagement in Africa. The picture that you're painting is China comes offering proposed solutions to durable problems like access to infrastructure. They do so at a high price, but many African countries don't have that alternative. Many people perceive China's engagement in Africa as being strategic, as being about defending and advancing their interests and potentially in an exploitive way. This appears to have led to a bit of a divide between sort of what everyday people perceive and what political elites or maybe business leaders on the continent perceive of China's role. How is China's presence perceived, and concretely, how do we offer that alternative?
Alternative is one, and this is something I've been talking about for some time. We must address the issues that driven 54 African countries, or it's a good number of African countries. We must address those issues that are driven China. Nobody will go to those high interest loans. And these are areas of infrastructure because their focus is infrastructure. We know and elections. If you look at elections in Africa, any community that requires a road, if you don't do it, you cannot win election in that area. Now, China said, if you need money, we. Another thing is the conditionalities for that particular loan. While China focus is on interest rate and maybe some few other conditions, the loans from the Western world tend to have a long list to build maybe a health facility for women. You don't need to have long conditions for it. Just focus on that. China focuses on few conditions, which is driving some of these African countries, because they don't want to put you at a fix. But in the long run, you know that whatever you are signing for is going to be a disaster to your people. If the people need roads, you buy roads. So if we can address, if the one especially can address those things that have driven African governments, China, it is not going to help us in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think Western loans are associated with a greater degree of, or forms of Western support, a greater degree of conditionality, and there are long-term challenges with what China is doing for the interests of African countries, but there are such urgent short-term needs that are driving a need to respond. Sebastian, what's your reaction to those comments? I guess this builds on your comments about financial engagement, but is it realistic for Canada to play a role in offering Africa alternatives in terms of support and accessing infrastructure, the kinds of reasonable, accessible loans that allow economic development to take place? And is there a desire for that alternative?
I think there's a desire for the alternative, but I think that also the capacity and financial constraints of the Canadian government requires that probably the Canadian government continues to work with investments through the African Development Bank, which I know Canada has put some money in, and also probably the African Finance Corporation and other multilateral agencies that are working, already in Africa to support trade and investment. The problem, unfortunately, with most of those large institutions is that they tend to support large projects, generally speaking, not small scale business, projects. And 80% plus of all the business activity in Canada is small, medium-sized companies. So there's an asymmetry between all the money that's being pumped by Western donors and Western companies into the African Development Bank and all the Africa Exim Bank and AFC, all of which institutions I know quite well and I support, and the actual reality of how do you get somebody in your constituency in Saskatchewan who is a medium-sized company, maybe they have 15, 20 employees. How do you actually get that person to begin to see Africa as a potential market for whatever widgets they are producing in Saskatchewan? Or maybe it's a farmer exporting wheat or exporting grain or exporting chickens or exporting meat. Whatever it is that is the principal economic activity there, how do you get that person to connect to a constituent in Lawrence's district who wants to buy that product? That transaction may not be worth more than $250,000. And clearly, and again, I'm being very generous here. So assuming that you have a transaction between a small, medium-sized company in Saskatchewan, in Yorkton, or in Buffalo Narrows, or in Saskatoon, and a company in Lawrence's district, and let's say the volume of that over a 1 year period is even say 250,000. Let's say they do five $50,000 transactions. My question is, there are very few institutions, either on the Canadian side or on the African side, who will support such a person. And yet 80% of all the total volume of business activity, both in Lawrence's district and in your district, is at that level. So in a certain sense, if Canada is not going to be able to attack that problem and is going to play at the larger level, at the infrastructure level, then clearly I think that some investments through these established institutions with some strings attached in terms of buying some of the implements from Canada, using Canadian technology, using Canadian expertise, Canadian financing would be interesting. So I think that in a certain sense, the Canadian government, both at the political level and at the institutional permanent level, has yet to decide in a decisive way what the thrust of engagement with Africa would be. Under Prime Minister Harper, I think there was a lot of discussion about sanitation and hygiene and WASH, all these programs that were looking at healthcare related issues. Then in the early part of the Prime Minister Trudeau administration, we're dealing with women and gender issues and gender empowerment and women's empowerment issues. So a lot of the money went into advocacy. And in these latter parts, I think there's a lot more discussion on trade, etc. But there's a little bit of a scattered approach in terms of what we need to do and where the focus has to be. So I would say that a lot of the average African businessmen and women gravitate more quickly to China, more quickly to Dubai, more quickly to Turkey. Turkey has become a major player in business because it's much easier for them to, with their $50,000 or $40,000, go buy the products there. So I think that we have, hopefully in the next government, if the Conservatives were to emerge victorious, a real serious realignment and reimagining of the relationship with Africa. The last thing I'll say is that you are completely 100% correct that Africa is a swing geopolitical entity in this new world order where you have the West on one side and Russia and China and others on the other side. And I think that if you see what is happening to France in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Guinea, it's very concerning because that tells you that a major part of the Western alliance is losing its foothold, its interest, its capacity in Africa. And I think that for us to engage from Canada with this swing region, we have to come to the table with more concrete plans, which will require.
Yeah, just quickly picking up on that. I mean, and I think it's good that we mentioned sort of the French government's ongoing complicated relationship, to say the least, with countries in French West Africa. Like the West's argument is that it stands for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law in opposition to China and Russia. But my sense is that, unfortunately, the way the West may be perceived in a lot of Africa is not so much associated with freedom and democracy because of the colonial history, and in fact because of continuing issues with French policy, for example. Is that part of the problem? And do we need to take a hard look at ourselves and say, how do we truly be countries that stand for freedom and democracy, make a decisive break with past practices if we're going to actually have a constructive relationship?
I think the short answer is that you can't eat democracy. You cannot pay school fees with freedom. People need to pay their school fees, and people need to eat food, and people need to have jobs. So I think that the vast majority of Africans, whether they're in Kampala or in Lagos or in Accra or in Dakar, yes, they may like democracy, yes, they may like freedom, but at the end of the month, tomorrow is the 1st of February. Every family on earth, especially in Africa, is thinking about their bills. And what about jobs? What about? So I think that most people, it's not that they are opposed to democracy, but in their hierarchy of values, their Maslow's hierarchy of values, democracy and freedom is not number 1 or number 2 or number 3.
Yeah. Lawrence, what do you think about that?
Just maybe to add on what Sebastian has said, I'm looking for that. If you look at the amount of money that came from Canada to Uganda, it's a lot, or to other African countries, it's too much. But the local person is not aware that Canada has been helping their communities. The money on paper is so big, the amount of money on paper is so big, but it doesn't reach the grassroots population, or not even aware. If you talk about Ukraine and Russia, people in my village, women and children, young people, they even don't know anything about that. What they want is, they want to strengthen their saving groups, they want to do their businesses, they want good health care, they want water. So you don't need to punish the population. The president or someone is having a divergent view. And that can only be done if you deal with small-scale crises that are working at the grassroots. In my constituency, I have 400 villages with 1,200 groups, and we are supporting them through the Songa Community Foundation to women, integrated games and sport for young people. How the big funds, what the big funds, the international community is talking about, where it is going. For us, we are working with them with the little resources we have, so that we can empower them in businesses. Basically, I want to agree with that position. And then maybe the last thing is, if the African young people can interact with young people in Canada and so on, and also some leaders can also have kind of dialogues and discussion. Canadian children can also know about Africa. Africa can also know about Canada, but at the same time, it can promote opportunities, identification of opportunities on both sides. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This hour has just flown by. One area we could go, we probably don't have time to really delve into it, is the issue of visa access in Canada, because my sense is that one of the challenges is that it's very difficult for people from Africa to get a visa, and that's also an impediment for people that want to come and do business. And so.
Yes, I wanted to that is one of the conditions I was talking about, even for loan and so on business. It is very easy, not even to go, just to send the passport to the embassy of China in Kampala and get visa to go and buy these things. He has his own money, but now because our society is not so formal.
What we're getting is there are significant challenges for getting visas to Western countries that don't exist in the case of traveling to China, and that's another impediment to building understanding and attracting investment. And just like one quick question, and then we'll go to sort of closing comments for me. Is I'm not one of these people that spends a lot of time studying cryptocurrency, but I do think there's some interesting applications in terms of cross-border relationships, that it does allow smaller transactions from one side of the world to the other, using the potential associated with blockchain technology more broadly, and within that cryptocurrency. That's not to express an opinion about any particular kind of cryptocurrency, but just to say that the technology is there, that we do see potential for more cross-border interactions. Do one of you want to just briefly comment on whether there's the potential for this or other new payments technologies to make it easier to have a kind of small business to small business or people to people economic interactions between Canada and African nations?
I think one area where I haven't seen it yet, but it could be interesting, would be leveraging technology with M-Pesa and the payment system for people to lend money across the border, person to person, business to business. So what I mean is that, let's say there is a business in Mr. Songa's district which has $1,000 extra dollars, and they could put it in a bank, or they could lend it to a business in Tanzania that needs $1,000. So far, we have a very colonial banking system. The banks of Tanzania are regulated by Tanzania. The banks of Uganda are regulated by Uganda. There's very little cross-border financial flows, because to change from a Pula into Kwanza, into CD, into Naira is too complicated. But I think that whoever is able to do that will become a multi-billionaire. How do you lend money across borders? Because at different times of the year, maybe there's a big coffee harvest in one part of Africa, and at the same time there is a huge planting season happening in another part of Africa at the same time, and you have these seasonal issues. And at one point, one group needs money for fertilizer. At another point, another group has a lot of money that they've put in a Ponzi scheme or in a local savings and loans, which has gone bankrupt. So I think that if we get eventually down to what Mr. Songa described of supporting local businesses in a serious way, we have to figure out ways for that local business, if he can't or she can't access financing locally in the local district and cannot access it nationally in the national district, they can access it internationally. Half of all of the development in Canada, the money comes from the United States. I mean, almost all the money that has been raised into major infrastructural projects in Canada comes from the United States. Most of the money that is raised for most infrastructural and business projects in Canada come from China or Japan. But at that level, it's very easy for a guy in Silicon Valley to go to Japan and raise $10 million for a venture. And without cross-border flows, easy cross-border flows, most of what we now call Western civilization would have ceased to exist. And in a certain sense, we are sitting, Africa is not a poor continent. Africa is very rich. But the problem is that we are not able to trade amongst ourselves. The roads are terrible. We are it's up until about 15 years ago, we could not even communicate with each other. The cost of communication was impossible. Up until Ethiopian Airways and Kenyan Airways and a few others started doing very good work, we could not even travel within Africa. And I'm adding another aspect that we should be able to lend to each other within Africa. And that would really open up major capacities. And so the technology, I agree, blockchain technology could assist with that. But so far, the regulatory requirements in each country have made that impossible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating perspective in terms of where the potential is, where the opportunities are, and the role of I mean, physical infrastructure we've talked about, but also economic infrastructure. This has been a great conversation. I'll give the last word to both of you to wrap up, and this just I'll just say on my end, this just underlines my belief in the potential of Africa, my sense that strengthening the relationship provides just an immense amount of opportunity. But I'd love to hear any final thoughts from you on what steps we need to take to strengthen the relationship between Canada and various countries in Africa, and how to really leverage this opportunity for Africa's prosperity, but also for the benefit of Canada and Canadians.
This kind of conversation and dialogue should continue to have engagement of more stakeholders to see which strategies used in this kind of cooperation. Having frequent dialogues like this, a small group discussion, see a way forward for this, because we want direct cooperation with the small businesses.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sebastian.
Well, I would just say thank you again, Right Honourable Genius, and also Right Honourable Songa, for this conversation. It's a privilege to join you to discuss on Africa, and I hope and pray that as policies are being discussed and developed in Ottawa, some of these ideas will begin to penetrate more deeply into that. But I do have no doubt in my mind that this century is a century where Africa can again begin to rise in a very serious way. And I think that whatever Canada can do to be part of this would also be very beneficial to Canada's long-term economic stability, to diversify its markets and to diversify its sources of economic stability. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. Whether it's the economic circumstances or just the inevitable demographics, African countries will play a major driving role of politics in the 21st century. And I'm glad we have an opportunity to talk about that and how Canada can effectively engage with that reality. Thank you both, and for everybody who's listening, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Canada-Africa relations. Please leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Share this episode, and we'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks.